There's a photograph buried in a Tennessee courthouse basement that nobody wants you to see. 37 children standing in perfect rows. Not one of them is smiling. Not one of them is looking at the camera. And if you study their faces long enough, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. They all have the same eyes, the same hollow, distant eyes, because they all share the same grandfather and the same great-grandfather. And in some cases, the same father and uncle were the same man. This is the story of Reverend Josiah Caldwell and the congregation that became a family, and then became something else entirely, something the state of Tennessee tried to bury in 1978, along with the bodies they found in the church cellar. But here's what they couldn't bury: the records, the birth certificates with fathers listed as unknown, and mothers who were themselves the daughters of previous unknown fathers, the medical files documenting genetic disorders so rare that doctors had only seen them in textbooks about isolated populations on remote islands, and the testimonies. God, the testimonies. Because in 1979, when the children finally learned to speak, they told investigators things that made grown men leave the room. They described a world where the word family meant something different, where every wedding was attended by people who'd already married each other's siblings, where children grew up calling the same man both uncle and father, both grandfather and cousin, where the preacher stood at the pulpit every Sunday and told them this was God's plan. This was purity, this was how you kept the faith clean. But here's the thing that haunts me most about this case. It didn't happen in some compound behind barbed wire. It happened in a normal American town. The congregation shopped at the same grocery store as everyone else. Their children attended the same schools, at least until they didn't. Neighbors saw them every day and thought nothing of it, because Reverend Caldwell understood something terrifying about human nature. That if you control the story, you can control reality itself. And for 32 years he controlled every single story that family ever told themselves about who they were and why they could never ever leave. Josiah Caldwell arrived in Millbrook, Tennessee in 1946 with nothing but a leather Bible and a smile that people later described as too wide. He was 28 years old. He had no formal religious training, no seminary degree, no references from other churches, but he had something more valuable than credentials. He had certainty, the kind of certainty that makes people stop questioning and start following. He rented a barn on the outskirts of town and held his first service on a Sunday in March. 11 people showed up. By June, he had 43. By Christmas, the barn couldn't hold everyone anymore. People said he had a gift, that when Josiah Caldwell spoke about sin and salvation, you felt it in your bones, that he could look at you and see the thing you'd been hiding from yourself, and then he'd tell you exactly how to fix it. But what he was really doing was simpler and more insidious than anyone realized. He was identifying the vulnerable. The young widows still grieving husbands lost in the war, the families struggling with farms that were failing, the teenagers who felt too different, too strange, too hungry for certainty in an uncertain world. And he told them all the same thing, that the outside world was corrupt, that other churches had lost their way, that salvation required separation not from town, not yet, but from the contamination of outside thinking, outside influence, outside blood. That last part came slowly. At first, it was just suggestions during counseling sessions. Observations that the young people in his congregation seemed so much more righteous than the young people in town, that it would be a shame if they married outsiders and diluted that righteousness. Then it became guidance, then it became expectation, then it became doctrine. By 1952, Reverend Caldwell was performing marriages between members of the congregation exclusively, and by 1955 he'd performed 3 marriages that made the county clerk raise her eyebrows. First cousins, legal in Tennessee technically, unusual, certainly, but not yet alarming. The clerk filed the certificates and said nothing, because this is how it always begins. Not with something obviously criminal, but with something just uncomfortable enough that people look away. Something that makes you think, well, it's their business. It's their faith. Who am I to judge? And by the time you realize you should have been judging, should have been asking questions, should have been paying attention, it's already too late. The barn had become a church. The church had become a compound. And the congregation had become something that didn't have a name yet. Something that would take 30 more years to fully understand. In 1961, a social worker named Margaret Hensley made a home visit to the Caldwell compound. She'd received an anonymous report that children weren't attending school regularly, that some of them seemed developmentally delayed, that there were too many children living in too few houses, and nobody could quite explain whose children belonged to whom. Margaret knocked on the door of the main house at 9 in the morning. Reverend Caldwell answered in his church clothes, smiling that too wide smile, and invited her in for coffee. She wrote in her report that everything seemed normal. Clean house, polite children. The Reverend explained that they homeschooled according to biblical principles, that the children were shy around strangers because they lived righteous, sheltered lives, that any developmental concerns were simply the result of children being raised without the corruption of television and worldly influence. Margaret Hensley drank her coffee, checked a few boxes on her form, and left. She closed the case. Years later, after everything came out, she would tell a journalist that she still had nightmares about that coffee, about how Reverend Caldwell had watched her drink it with those calm, patient eyes, about how she'd felt something was wrong but couldn't name it, about how she'd been so eager to believe the simple explanation that she'd stopped looking for the complicated truth. Because here's what Margaret Hensley didn't see during that visit. She didn't see the prayer room in the basement where Reverend Caldwell conducted his private counseling sessions. She didn't see the ledger he kept, meticulously tracking every family line, every marriage, every birth, like a breeder tracking livestock. She didn't see the children who weren't allowed to come to the door, the ones who couldn't speak clearly because of cleft palates that ran in families that shouldn't have had genetic patterns at all, the ones whose eyes pointed in different directions, the ones who rocked back and forth when they thought no one was watching. And she definitely didn't see the doctrine that Reverend Caldwell had been preaching every Sunday for the past 9 years, the doctrine of blood purity, the teaching that God's chosen people had always kept their bloodlines separate, that Abraham married his half-sister, that the Israelites were commanded not to marry outside their tribe, that the faithful had a duty to preserve the sanctity of their lineage. He never used the word incest. He used words like consecrated and pure and set apart. He made it sound holy. He made it sound like sacrifice. And for people who'd been raised in his church, who'd never known another way of understanding the world, it didn't sound wrong. It sounded righteous. By 1961, there were 83 people living in the compound. 47 of them were children, and every single one of those children had parents who were at minimum second cousins. Most were first cousins. Some were closer than that, though the records were carefully obscured. Reverend Caldwell performed every marriage ceremony himself. He decided who married whom. He decided when, and he decided that these unions were blessed by God himself, which meant questioning them was questioning God. And in that compound, questioning God meant risking everything. The children stopped going to town school entirely in 1967. Reverend Caldwell told the school board it was for religious reasons, and Tennessee law allowed it. But there was another reason nobody talked about. The children were becoming noticeable. Teachers had started asking questions about why so many kids from the same church had similar medical issues. Why 3 siblings all had the same heart murmur. Why the Henderson girl and the Pryor boy, who weren't supposed to be related, both had that distinctive webbing between their fingers. Why so many of them struggled with lessons that should have been simple. So the children stayed home. And in staying home, they disappeared from the one place where outside eyes might have seen what was happening. They learned to read from the Bible. They learned arithmetic by counting offerings. They learned history from Reverend Caldwell's version of history, which began and ended with the faithful and the fallen. And they learned above all else that they were different from the children in town. Special, chosen, set apart. They learned that the outside world would never understand them, that outsiders would mock their purity and persecute their righteousness, that safety existed only within the compound walls, only within the family, only within the bloodline that Reverend Caldwell was so carefully preserving. By 1970, some of those children were old enough to marry, and Reverend Caldwell had plans for every single one of them. He'd been planning since they were born, actually, matching them like puzzle pieces, determining which genetic lines should combine with which. He kept his ledger updated with the precision of a scientist, though he would have been offended by the comparison. He wasn't playing God, he told his congregation. He was obeying God. He was fulfilling the sacred duty of keeping the chosen separate from the corrupted. Sarah Caldwell married her first cousin Daniel Pryor in the spring of 1971. She was 16, he was 19. They were both grandchildren of original congregation members, which meant they shared great-grandparents as well. The wedding was beautiful, people said. Sarah wore her mother's dress. The whole compound attended. Reverend Caldwell preached about the blessing of holy union between the righteous. And 6 months later, when Sarah gave birth to a daughter with catastrophic health problems that required specialists in Nashville to even diagnose, Reverend Caldwell told the congregation it was a test of faith, that God was refining them through suffering, that the child's struggles were a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to prove their devotion. The baby died before her first birthday. They buried her in the compound cemetery that most people in Millbrook didn't know existed, and Sarah, at 17 years old, was told to be grateful, told that her daughter was with God now, told that her next child would be stronger, and then she was pregnant again. Because that's what wives did in Reverend Caldwell's congregation. They submitted, they bore children, they accepted what God, through the Reverend, told them was right, even when everything in their body screamed that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. By 1975, the compound had become almost entirely self-sustaining. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and most importantly, they rarely left. Once a month, a few designated members would drive into Millbrook for supplies, but they moved through town like ghosts. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't engage in small talk. They bought what they needed and returned to the compound as quickly as possible. The people of Millbrook had grown used to them. That strange religious group on the edge of town. Those people who kept to themselves. Weird, sure, but harmless, except they weren't harmless. By 1975, there were 112 people living in the compound. 71 of them were children, and those children were suffering in ways that most people couldn't imagine. Medical records that would later be unsealed showed patterns of genetic disorders consistent with multiple generations of close relative reproduction, congenital heart defects, skeletal abnormalities, developmental disabilities, vision problems, hearing loss, immune deficiencies. Some children had multiple conditions. Some children were in constant pain, and none of them were receiving adequate medical care because Reverend Caldwell taught that doctors were instruments of the corrupt world, that faith could heal what medicine could not, that suffering was refinement. There was one doctor who saw some of the compound children, Dr. Raymond Foster, who ran a small practice in Millbrook and who sometimes treated congregation members who couldn't hide their medical emergencies. He would later testify that he'd raised concerns multiple times, that he'd seen things that troubled him deeply. But when he'd contacted social services, he was told the same thing Margaret Hensley had concluded 14 years earlier. Religious freedom, parental rights. Without clear evidence of abuse, there was nothing that could be done. And the evidence was always just unclear enough, just hidden enough, just explained away by Reverend Caldwell's calm, reasonable voice and his promises that everything was fine, everything was God's will, everything was exactly as it should be. But here's the thing about secrets this big. They have weight, they create pressure, and eventually something has to break. In January of 1978, a 17-year-old girl named Rebecca Pryor broke. She'd been married to her cousin for 11 months. She was pregnant with her second child. Her first child had died at 3 months old from complications the doctors said they'd only seen in populations with severe inbreeding. And Rebecca, 17 years old and drowning in grief and trapped in a marriage she'd been told was holy, walked away from the compound in the middle of the night and didn't stop walking until she reached the sheriff's office in Millbrook at 4 in the morning. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have run? Would you have believed the preacher when he told you this was God's plan? Because that's the thing that makes this story so disturbing. These weren't stupid people. These weren't evil people. These were people who'd been shaped by a system that made the unthinkable seem normal. And once Rebecca walked through that door and started talking, once she started pulling back the curtain on what had really been happening for 32 years, the system couldn't hold anymore. The sheriff didn't believe her at first. Or maybe he didn't want to believe her, because what Rebecca was describing sounded impossible. A religious leader systematically arranging marriages between cousins, second cousins, and closer relations for 3 decades. Children with severe genetic disorders being denied medical care. A cemetery on the compound with 38 graves, most of them infants and children who'd never been registered with the state. Records of births that were never officially documented. And perhaps most disturbing, Rebecca's claim that Reverend Caldwell himself had fathered children with multiple women in the congregation, including his own daughter. But Rebecca had brought something with her, the ledger. She'd stolen it from Reverend Caldwell's office before she ran, and that ledger was meticulous. 32 years of careful record-keeping. Every marriage, every birth, every death. Family trees that twisted back on themselves like braided rope. Notations about which genetic traits were appearing in which children. Plans for future matches, and hundreds of notes in Reverend Caldwell's handwriting, explaining his reasoning, explaining how he was preserving the faithful, how he was creating a pure lineage, how he was fulfilling God's will. The sheriff called the state police called social services called the FBI, and on February 3rd, 1978, a convoy of vehicles drove up to the compound gates. Reverend Caldwell met them at the entrance, still smiling that too wide smile, still calm, still certain. He told them they were persecuting the righteous, that this was religious discrimination, that they had no right to interfere with the faithful. And then one of the social workers asked to see the children, all of them, together, where they could be examined by doctors and interviewed privately. What happened next would haunt everyone who was there. 71 children were brought out of the various buildings in the compound, and what investigators saw made several of them physically ill. Children who could barely walk due to skeletal deformities. Children who couldn't speak clearly because of facial abnormalities. Children who were clearly intellectually disabled. Children who flinched when adults came near them. And children who seemed physically normal, but who had that same look in their eyes. That same hollow, distant expression that was in the photograph from the courthouse basement. The look of people who'd learned very young that the world was not safe, that adults could not be trusted, and that questioning meant punishment. The children were removed that day, all 71 of them. They were taken to hospitals in Nashville and Knoxville and Memphis. They were examined, they were interviewed, and slowly, over weeks and months, some of them learned to talk about what life in the compound had really been like, about the marriages they'd been told were blessings, about the babies who died and were buried without ceremony, about the doctrine that told them their suffering was holy, about Reverend Caldwell's private counseling sessions that weren't counseling at all, about the punishment for asking questions, about the terror of believing that the outside world would destroy you but the inside world was destroying you faster. Reverend Josiah Caldwell was arrested on February 3, 1978. He was charged with child abuse, neglect, and violations of marriage law. Additional charges would come later, much more serious charges, based on the testimonies of women who'd been in the congregation since childhood. But he never stood trial. On March 17, 1978, Reverend Caldwell was found dead in his cell. The official report said heart attack. Some people believed it. Some people didn't. But everyone agreed on one thing, that he'd taken secrets with him, names he'd never given, crimes he'd never admitted to, graves that were never fully explained.